So I've just read and analyzed the prompt. This prompt says, write an essay that synthesizes material from at least 3 of the sources and develops a position on the purpose, if any, of historic preservation. So I want to talk about the purpose, if there is any, of historic preservation. Now I'm going to read the sources. Now, big mistake that people make when they're reading sources is they focus on reading as if they're reading for pleasure, or they have in an infinite period of time. You have 15 minutes. You're not reading in this open-ended way. You're reading very specifically for the purpose of historical preservation. Don't get lost in this person's argument or what this cartoon or graph says. Focus on how you can develop an argument about the purpose of historical preservation. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to scroll past this first page and I'm going to look at source A. Now, as I read, I'm going to mark these sources up. My goal is to, again, read with that purpose in mind, but make annotations for myself that are neat and useful. So I'm going to set a timer for 15 minutes right now. And so I've given myself these 15 minutes. Source A, it says Alex Tabarrok against historic preservation. Well, that's really useful, isn't it, right? I already know that this person is against historic preservation. I know it was written in 2016, which is pretty recent. And then I get this really nice summary here. It says the following excerpt is from a blog by 2 professors of economics at George Mason University. So I already know the person's perspective. It's 2 people. They are economics professors, and they don't like historic preservation, I'm gonna guess, just based on the title. So, their first sentence, repeal all historic preservation laws. Okay, now that I get the argument, notice what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna read for the purpose of historic preservation. Does this source, do these 2 professors tell me about the purpose of historic preservation? How can I use this source? So I'm going to read faster. Okay. And they list 3 reasons. That's useful. Okay, so they see this as a pretext. The purpose of historical preservation is not what it's sort of usually advertised. So, a nation in decline looks to the past in a vain attempt to preserve what was once great. Preservation is what you do to dead butterflies. This is the kind of line that I could actually quote rather than summarize, right? Because there's no way of capturing that kind of energy of the line. So I'll leave just sort of a little star over here as kind of a really interesting quote. Ironically, blah, blah, blah. The cost of preservation is future greatness. Okay. Good. Okay, and this is definitely their most well-developed. So I have 1, 2, and 3. They're addressing a counter-argument in the final paragraph. So I'm going to mark down that this has a strong bias against preservation. This is just a quick note to myself. What happens when I'm reading 6 sources is they get confusing after source 3 or 4. I can't remember who was for or against. I can't remember what things said. So I want to make sure that I have this strong, clear headline for this. And it seems to be argument 3 that is the most important one. This is the bulkiest paragraph here. So that's source A. I'm going to move quicker. Source B, the Atlas of Re-Urbanism, Buildings and Blocks in American Cities. It's from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Okay, good. So these people are in favor of historic preservation. Also from 2016 and Access 2019. The following graph is taken from a resource for city leaders and urban planners published by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Character score refers to the diversity of age and size of buildings. High character means a mix of older and newer buildings, and low character means mostly new buildings. Notice that in these little kind of captions at the front, I'm getting information I can really use. They're defining key terms. The test writers do not want to give you material that tests your outside knowledge. You don't need to be an expert in historic preservation to write great things about this, or even to read and understand these sources. So I'm just going to mark character here, character score, because that's going to be important. I always like to read the headers and footers here. So it says percent of women and minority-owned enterprises. High is going to be in the light gray versus low in the black. Character score areas. Then it says the city, and I see a whole bunch of American cities down the side. And then, let's see, city percentage in high character score areas versus low character score areas. Then I see the trend. The trend is clearly moving in this direction. But what does it mean? Percentage in high character score areas. Now here I'm going to say something. I'm going to choose to spend a minute figuring out what this thing says, but it might be useful for you if you're overwhelmed by a graph like this to actually move on. Try to give it a 30-second, 1 minute go, but don't waste 4.5 minutes here. You've only got 15, right? So this is an important strategic choice. You can make a great synthesis essay without really working with source B. It's not a thing where you have to include all 6 sources to get the point. This is not a DBQ in AP US History. Okay, so wait, let's see. Portland, Maine has a larger percentage of women and minority-owned enterprises in high character score areas, whereas Phoenix has a larger percent in the low character score areas. 60 seems to be this cutoff down here, right? There's no one that exceeds 60. I'm going to identify this as a neutral source, even though it's coming from a positive place. It's something that people, I think, want to, identify with, or that this somehow must serve their arguments for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. But I'm honestly not quite sure what they're doing. Here's another tip, actually, to think about. When the test writers include something like this, it must have some purpose. It must that they can assume students can get. So I'm going to move on, even though I'm just honestly not sure about what to do with source B. Source C, Randall Mason, Fixing Historic Preservation, a Constructive Critique of Significance. This is in something from 2004, a little earlier. The following is excerpted from an article in an online architecture journal. So not an economist, not a chart, not for or against per se, but an architecture journal. Okay, so I'll take a minute to read this. He's talking about problems. So he uses the example of Chaco Canyon, which might be useful. So different groups are getting different values, different historical significance from this one site, but conflicts have arisen. So we get, therefore, in this relatively neutral article, we get a view of problems with historical preservation. Specifically, we get conflicts, and we get changing meaning. Now, the question, remember, says, what about the purpose for historic preservation? If the purpose of historic preservation is about significance, what happens when the significance is contested? So that's what source C is doing. I got to keep moving here. I get a cartoon. Oh, these are always fun. So the following is an editorial cartoon. And this guy right over here is saying, I'd like to bring my new business to downtown. And he has a sign that says new store on it. Then it says, that's great as long as you don't disturb our historic setting. But look, the historic setting is a rundown building with broken glass. So that so this is a negative view, negative portrayal of historic sites. Because historic sites are run down, they need a lot of money, and they also stop new businesses, which was a theme that they brought up in the prompt. So when you're stopping new businesses in the name of historic preservation, I guess the question is, like, how do we choose between preserving our own history and actually enabling ourselves to grow and develop an economy with new stores. I'm going to move on to source E because I'm under time constraints, and this is a long one. I got to move quickly here. Okay, historic preservation from Over the Rhine Foundation, whatever that is. Okay, the following is excerpted from the website of a foundation. Oh, now they tell me. Dedicated to the preservation of the Over the Rhine neighborhood in Cincinnati, Ohio. So I'm assuming this is going to be for historical preservation. And now I'm going to move quickly. Let's see. Okay, blah, blah, blah. A lot of description. I'm going to skip over the details. If I need to come back to this later, I can. And okay, just looking at the time here, I have about 5 minutes left, which is really good because I only have one more source after this. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Most American things have been spared. Mansions, unique architecture, working class immigrant neighborhood, wealthy beer barons lived across the street from their breweries, etc., etc. Over the Rhine was once one of America's most densely populated neighborhoods. It's okay, Cincinnati is, and I'm skipping down. While earlier decades saw widespread razing of blocks and streetscapes, recent years have brought new, equally insidious phenomenon, demolition by neglect. That's interesting. As poverty rates and disinvestment grew in OTR buildings, they were increasingly abandoned and gradually deteriorated. Today, many buildings stand vacant and in dire need of repair, yet building owners remain unwilling to bring their properties up to code. Destruction continues. Okay, what I'm looking for, and this is huge, this source E, is I need to get something about the purpose of historic preservation. So it's not just about wealthy buildings, about, let's say, special architecture, right? Ordinary buildings are part of this as well. And let's see, is the tone relatively neutral? It seems to be pro-preservation. I inferred that just from what it was saying at the beginning. So I'm going to say that this is pro-preservation and makes this claim that it's not just about that it's for all sorts of buildings. And now I'm going to go down to source F. I'm staying within time. It's Catesby Lee, Historic Preservation from First Principles. The following is excerpted from an article in an online journal published by an organization focused on intellectual conservatism. Okay, so they start with some examples here. Though advocates of the steady broadening of preservation's purview see it as an indication of the nation's increasing cultural maturity, one could just as easily regard it as a symptom of cultural decadence. Indeed, preservation's emergence as a major cultural movement, blah, 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 Penn Station in New York, and this created the preservation things. Okay, I'm just reading through all this. Okay, so he takes the stance that this author takes the stance that historical preservation is good, but the laws must change. Okay, now I only have a little bit of time left here in my 15-minute reading period. I need to transition quickly into the next steps where I'm going to write a thesis and plan my essay.